Good evening, Professor, and thank you very much for joining us at our seminar. It's a great honour to have you. Mixing with the Northern Europeans is a new experience for us, so lucky we've got English in common. So my first question would be about Hammarskjöld, how he became Secretary General of the UN at a time when the Cold War and decolonisation emerged as issues strongly influencing global policy matters. So what would you say happened in terms of decolonisation during Hammarskjöld's time, and how did it impact on world politics?
First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to join you in your efforts to bring self-determination to the people of West Papua. It's something which was very close as a general notion to Hammarskjöld's heart. He was the UN Secretary General when the so-called winds of change blew across the African continent, not only but mainly bringing self-determination to former African colonies. And Dag Hammarskjöld, looking back on the 8 years of his terms in office, can be dubbed the Secretary General of decolonization and the Secretary General of what was perceived the weak states. For him, the United Nations provided the space and the forum for all people and peoples in this world, especially those whose voices did not have the power to be heard. So looking at his track record, one could say he was, in today's jargon, an anti-hegemonic Secretary General, who was willing to speak truth to power on all sides. His commitment was to the Charter of the United Nations and the fundamental values and principles which were enshrined in the Charter. And in his own interpretation, this included the right to self-determination, as the Trusteeship Council basically also endorsed. And as Secretary General, he was willing to take a stance. In some of his speeches, he declared that colonialism, in his view, was untenable. And wherever colonial relations existed, he was willing to support the desire of the people to get rid of foreign occupation and be able to decide over their own destination themselves. So to that extent, I think Hammarskjöld was a positive example and a role model for those people who aspired to be allowed to govern themselves.
Yes, right. Very different man to most leaders around today. So to what extent do you think has the UN and the role of the Secretary General changed over time? Is it possible even to follow in his footsteps any longer with the same sort of dedication and impact as a Secretary General?
Times have changed. Global politics have changed, geostrategic interests have changed, and the role of the Secretary General, as influential as it might be as the highest international civil servant, has changed too. Already looking and analyzing Hammarskjöld's role, it was very clear that any individual in such a position, never mind the values and principles that individual was guided by, was meeting institutional limitations. Mm-hmm. As today, already then, the big powers had the say. They were in control over the Security Council, and if they dismissed the advocacy, then it was very difficult, if not impossible, to pursue any agenda further. That already happened to Hammarskjöld. He was unable to take a stance in Central America when the US considered it as its backyard. He was unable to intervene when Russia moved into Hungary in 1956. He was unable to take to task France in 1961 when they occupied parts of Tunisia, because the Security Council prevented any action through the vetoes applied. And that happened both on the side of the Soviet camp and on the side of Western imperialism. That has not changed. Maybe what has changed is that as Second Secretary General, Hammarskjöld still had more leeway to cultivate values and implement them. He had a very clever diplomatic strategy, and he used the maneuvering space, which was still existing to some extent. And he was able to make some clever moves, like in the Suez Crisis, to bring together the interests of the Soviet Union and the USA, and through that outmaneuver France and Great Britain. The same happened in some of the decolonization processes when he was able in 1960 to obtain a mandate for UN intervention in the Congo. But the maneuvering space has become smaller, if it exists at all any longer. And while Hammarskjöld was a rather strong Secretary General, I think ever since that, the big powers became more and more suspicious and limited the individual space of Secretary Generals. Would a Dag Hammarskjöld become a Secretary General today? Definitely not. He was more a general than a secretary. But under today's geostrategic circumstances and interests, the big powers are looking for a secretary and not a general. They want to set the agenda, and they don't want to have what they would consider undue interference by a Secretary General and the Secretariat of the United Nations. And we see this with the decline of multilateralism, where global governance is undermined and eroded, and the United Nations are not stronger than they were then, they are weaker than they were 50 years ago. So even if a Dag Hammarskjöld would be Secretary General today, I think the limitations of implementing and strictly pursuing the values and principles he personified and embodied would have been even more difficult.
Right. So a daunting task ahead for West Papua. Right. So he did.
If I may add, it is a daunting task, and I find it quite interesting to see parallels between West Papua and the country where I had joined the liberation struggle, being the former territory of Southwest Africa, nowadays Namibia, which after a long struggle for independence became independent only in 1990. Now, Southwest Africa was a mandated territory to the apartheid South Africa regime. And we finally managed, with the support of the Global South in the mid-1960s, to change the parameters of the international law applied and declaring the occupation of Southwest Africa as a sea mandate as illegal by apartheid South Africa. For me, there is a parallel to West Papua and other countries like Morocco and West Sahara, which the two come to my mind as two of the most obvious challenges in a similar situation today. What has changed is that the North-South dichotomy has been replaced. You have southern countries which apply power and politics that replicate northern power and politics. And they turn into colonizing countries, Morocco with the West Sahara, Indonesia with West Papua. And you do not have a clear cut where the Global South would go out in support of the occupied territories and its people, because they are divided on that and they follow other interests, which make it almost impossible, as you know, when it comes to West Papua since the early 1960s, to gain majority support of the Global South in the global governance body of the United Nations. And that's a very sad and tragic story, because values and principles are sacrificed even by those countries who benefited from the application of the values and principles when it came to their own path to independence.
Yes. Well, we had a good run last year with the African, Caribbean, Pacific group. After about 18 months of internal negotiating, I suppose you'd call it, they have passed a motion on West Papua. That doesn't mean to say, I suppose, they'll vote the same in the United Nations as individual states, but they've done it, and it was Uganda that led the charge. Yeah, so we've got a tiny little office in Uganda, you know. So my sort of final question would be, Dag Hammarskjöld, yes, we've discussed that he negotiated many complex decolonisation issues that involve powerful Cold War players and resource-rich states like the Congo and West Papua. Do you imagine he would have succeeded in convincing the UN member states in 1961 to declare as invalid both the Dutch and the Indonesian claims to sovereignty and recognise the indigenous Papuan people as the sovereign owners of their land?
According to the sources we have at hand, he seemed to be determined to follow such a strategy. Unfortunately, due to the untimely death of him and 15 others in a plane crash, which we have reasons to assume was not an accident, but an assassination, we were never privileged to witness if he would have been successful. Mm. But given his diplomacy, given his credibility and his trust among the new member states of the UN, he might have had a chance to convince enough member states in favor of such a resolution being adopted. Mm. I have no doubt that he would have tried as much as possible to achieve such a resolution. Mm. He was a very principled person of integrity. Mm. And I'm very sure he would have dedicated all his time and strength to achieve such a resolution, which would allow the right to self-determination for the people of West Papua. Mm.
Well, the Dutch, he negotiated with the Dutch and they agreed to it in the end. So he'd got one of the powers on side, and I think they only agreed because they trusted him. You know, they certainly wouldn't have agreed to do the same thing under UTANT. Professor, it's been so wonderful talking to you, and I hope we can keep in touch. And thank you very much for contributing to our seminar today.
I thank you very much, and I hope you all have an enjoyable event which also serves strengthening your energy to follow your further struggles and achieve the ultimate goal. Let me just add one final remark. Dag Hammarskjöld was a lover of nature. Being in that indirect way, more than half a century after his untimely death, represented in a tree planting ceremony, which is linked to the struggle for independence of people, is something I think he would very much have appreciated.